Okay, again, we're looking at church, a relationship to opportunity. This would be part 6 in this segment. We've seen that church provides a special place of relationship. We saw that the psalmist's view of God's house, some of the feelings that God's house aroused in the psalmist. We've looked at individual and congregational worship, and they go together. We cannot worship as a congregation if we do not worship individually. We've seen that worship is all about God. It's not about us. It's all about God. That is, all the attention is to be upon God. We started last week looking at what is involved in worship. And there's many things, of course. First of all, there has to be an awareness of God. We can't worship what we're not aware of. There has to be a desire toward God. Really, it's not just a desire, it's all our desires moving in the direction of God. Our hearts have to be united to God. There has to be a drawing near to God. All of those things happen in worship. We want to look at some other things that constitute worship. The first one we want to mention tonight, of course, I believe, is something that is greatly missing in our worship. And that is, there has to be a sense of wonder concerning God. A sense of wonder. God, of course, is wonderful. More wonderful than anything or anybody else. He's wonderful in who He is. Who He is ought to cause great wonder within you and I. He is wonderful in what He says. Everything He says is more wonderful than anything else. And He's wonderful in everything that He does. And as we congregate together, we're to have our focus upon who He is, upon what He does, upon what He says. And if that's so, then we cannot help but be overcome with a sense of wonder, marvel, amazement, just at the person of God. Again, we need to get our minds off everything else and just focus upon God. And the result is wonder. By wonder, I mean that we are exceedingly struck in mind, we are amazed, and we are in awe of God. It's to be fascinated by God. It's to be captivated by God. Worship does not need entertainment, because in true worship, the worshiper is fascinated by God, captivated with the Lord. So there's to be this element of wonder in true worship. And I believe to a large degree, from the point that we were saved till now, we have lost wonder. And that inhibits worship. That's a huge obstacle to worship. Notice in Matthew 7, verse 28, Jesus has just finished the Sermon on the Mount, recorded in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And we read in verse 28, "And it came to pass, when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at his doctrine." They were filled with wonder. The reason is he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. But they were astonished. They sat there, listened, and were astonished. After he finished speaking, they were astonished in wonder. Notice in Matthew 14, we have the apostles. Matthew 14, verse 33. We know that Jesus has miraculously calmed a life-threatening storm. Then they that were in the ship came and worshipped him, saying, "Of a truth, thou art the Son of God." They were astonished. They were amazed. They've seen Peter saved as he was sinking in the water. They've seen the wind cease. And they're amazed. They're filled with wonder. Notice in Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6, verse 51. "And he went unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased. And they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure." They were amazed beyond measure. They were filled with wonder. And I believe we need a sense of wonder if we are going to truly worship God. There has to be this awe. There has to be this fascination with God. And it's the lack of this spiritual wonder that has led to such a shallowness in so much of what is called worship, and has led to numerous attempts by man to create wonder in the worship service. It's not up to man to create wonder in the worship service. Just focusing on God, we should be filled with wonder. Man cannot create that. And all of man's attempts to do so basically just results in carnality, results in entertainment. So we need to be struck by the wonder of who God is, the wonder of what God says, the wonder of what God has done. And it's this that causes us to stand in awe of God. Notice in Psalm 4, Psalm 4 and verse 4. Psalm 4 and verse 4. Stand in awe. That's all we'll read there. Stand in awe. That's what we ought to do when we worship. Psalm 33, verse 8. Psalm 33 and verse 8. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of Him. Stand in awe of Him. That's who it's all about. In Psalm 119 and verse 161. Princes have persecuted me without a cause, but my heart standeth in awe of thy word. But my heart standeth in awe. And this awe, this reverence, leads to greater reverence, which leads to further and greater worship. So it just keeps on going. As we worship, we ought to come with a spirit of awe. The awe ought to increase, and as the awe increases, the worship increases, and the further we go in worship. In other words, again, as we said last week, it leaves an impression upon us. True worship will always leave an impression and an impact upon us, a positive one, always. If it doesn't, we haven't worshiped. It's that simple. So without this wonder, there is no real worship. Connected to this wonder and what feeds this wonder is humility of soul. Humility of soul. When there is a knowledge of God, when there is an awareness of His presence, and our heart is connected with Him, and we are being drawn near to God, and we are in awe of God, there's a humility. There's a humility of spirit on the part of the worshiper. We ought to be humbled at the thought that we can even come before God. We ought to be humbled before we get here. And as we get closer, we ought to be more humbled. And then as we walk in the door, we ought to even be more humbled. And then as we sit and begin to worship, we ought to even be more humbled. In all true worship, there is a humility of spirit. So it is detrimental to worship to build up man. To build up man is detrimental to worship. That's not what we're here for. We're not here to build up man. We're here to exalt God. And to build up man goes against that. So there has to be this humility of spirit on our part. And the greater our degree of our knowledge of God and the greater sense we have of His presence, and the more we are connected to Him and the closer we are to Him, the more humbled we become. Humility is a spirit that has a vivid realization of the greatness of God. Jesus said in Matthew 5, at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." And that's the foundation of the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And the poor in spirit is opposed to all forms of pride. It's opposed to all self-sufficiency. It's opposed to all self-reliance, all self-confidence. The proud of heart cannot truly worship God. Poverty of spirit is required to worship the Lord. Now, it's hard to offend. It's hard to hurt someone's feelings that are poor in spirit. They're not easily offended by what somebody does or does not do, or what somebody says or does not say. They're not offended by those things because they're humble. No one can truly worship God who is not poor in spirit. To be poor, it's you and I taking our rightful place before God, and then rendering to God honor, glory to Him. And I don't believe it's possible to take our proper position before God and to render to God outside of poor in spirit. Church is the last place that you ought to find pride. It's the last place in all the world that you ought to find pride. It shouldn't exist. The poor in spirit have a vivid realization of their own personal sin. They know that they're sinners. And they know something about their sin. And they see no goodness in themselves outside of God. And they're ready to confess their sin. And they're ready to turn from their sin. Unlike those who claim their innocence and try to defend their sin. A proud person never tries to, a humble person never tries to defend their sin. They never try to justify their sin. The poor in spirit realize they have nothing. They realize they can do nothing, and in and of themselves, they have need of all things. John 15:5. Notice if we turn there, John 15:5, very familiar verse. Jesus speaking. I am the vine, ye are the branches. The branches need the vine. The branches have to have the vine. The vine does not need the branches. Jesus says, I am the vine, ye are the branches. He that abideth in me, as a branch would a vine, and I in him, the same bringeth forth much fruit. For without me, the vine, ye, the branches, can do nothing. Can do nothing. And so it is with the humble and the poor in spirit. They realize this. And they come before God to worship, and they're just filled with wonder that God would even allow us in His presence. It's the very opposite of the Laodicean spirit that we read of in Revelation 3 in verse 17. They thought they had need of nothing. They thought they had everything. They were righteous. They didn't need anything from God. But God said, you're poor, you're miserable. It's the very opposite of the Laodicean spirit. In addition, the poor in spirit possess a spirit of unworthiness, a sense of unworthiness of God's blessings. Notice in Genesis 32, and this is true of every single one of us. Doesn't matter who we are. This is so. Genesis 32:10. I am not worthy of the least of all thy mercies. Not worthy. That's true of all of us. So when God's merciful to us, that'll fill us with wonder. We're not worthy. It wouldn't be called mercy if we were worthy. The very word mercy implies that we're unworthy. And we're not worthy of the least of His mercies. Psalm 51:17. Psalm 51:17. The sacrifices of God. Okay, that would be the outward formalities of worship. The outward aspects of worship. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. A broken and a contrite heart, O God, thou wilt not despise or think lightly of. A broken spirit. What is that? Well, that which is broken is disabled. A broken spirit. A disabled spirit. Disabled to what? Its own ways. That's pleasing to God. I'm including Christianity in general, put emphasis upon the outward sacrifices. But that's not where God puts the emphasis. He puts it on a broken spirit. A spirit that has been disabled to its own ways. And that goes along with the poor in spirit. So this broken spirit and contrite heart goes beyond all outward formalities. And God sees it as an excellent thing. Also, the poor in spirit, or the humble, they possess a tenderness. In Ezekiel 36 and 26, he speaks of a heart of stone, and he speaks of a heart of flesh. And he said, I will give you a heart of flesh. Now, there's a big difference between flesh and a stone. Huge difference. You can go outside, find a rock. You can kick that rock all night long. It won't feel a thing. You can take a hammer to it, a chisel. It will not feel a thing. You can beat it with a stick, do whatever you want. It will not feel anything. There are those who sit in a worship service, they don't feel a thing. Not a thing. They have a heart of stone. Heart of flesh, flesh feels. You beat flesh, it feels. You prick flesh, it feels. Flesh is tender. And in worship, we're to have tender heart. Our heart is to be tender. And if it's not, and again, that goes along with humility and the wonder. There's no worship without tenderness of heart. Another component of worship is a love for God. All is empty without this. And when I say a love for God, I'm not talking about a love for the God that we've imagined in our imaginations. I'm talking about a love for the God presented in this book. Without this, there can be no true worship. Only a lover of God can truly worship God. If we love God, He's our life. He's our life. Our heart is taken up with Him. There's a relationship. There's a relationship with Him. And we desire to be closer. We desire that our lives be more intertwined and weaved to Him, and to His will and His ways. That's the person that can worship the Lord. The person who walks in the house of God determined, I'm as close as I'm going to get, and I don't care what happens in that worship service. This is who I am. Well, you don't love God. A lover of God wants to be closer to God. A lover of God wants God to be more of a priority and a purpose in their life. A lover of God wants God to impact their life. A lover of God wants to be controlled and dominated by God. And that's the spirit we need when we come in worship. I want to be controlled by God. I want to be dominated by Him. I want Him to be first in all things. I want to please Him. That's love. And love seeks. If we love God, we seek God. And that's what worship is. It's a seeking of the Lord. Another component would be faith. Jesus told the woman at the well that God is a spirit. What that means is He's invisible. We're told that in 1 Timothy 1, verse 7, and also 1 Timothy 6, verse 16. God is invisible. He cannot be seen with the physical eye. Now, we see the evidences of God with the physical eye. Every time you look at creation, you're seeing the evidences of God. But you cannot see God with the physical eye. It requires faith. It requires a spiritual principle. Now, it is natural for man to desire to see what he worships. That's natural. And we see that in Exodus 32 when Moses was up in the mount. And Aaron made a golden calf for the people. They wanted to see. They wanted a representation of God. Man hasn't changed. Man still wants to see. They want to see. They want that which is visible. Well, the Lord addresses that in the second commandment, there in Exodus chapter 20, verses 4 through 6. Worship requires faith. And the second commandment forbids any representation, any image of God. It's forbidden. We're to worship by faith. So what is faith? What is faith? Well, it goes beyond intellectual knowledge. Hopefully we all know many things of God. Faith goes beyond intellectual knowledge. Faith goes beyond assent or agreement. It goes beyond seeing. So it is sight, but it goes beyond seeing with the human eye. Faith is confidence in God. Faith is assurance of God. Someone will say, well, if I could see God, then I could have confidence in Him. My reply would be, you can see God by faith, not by physical sight. It takes faith, and it's God who imparts faith. But faith has confidence in God. God says something, you have confidence in it because God said it. Faith is dependence upon God. Faith is reliance upon God. Can you worship God and not depend upon Him and not rely upon Him? I don't think so. Faith is leaning upon God, resting upon God. That's what we do when we worship. We lean upon God. We rest in God. Faith is looking to God. It's looking to God. It's cleaving to God. And again, this is so in all areas of our worship, whether it be singing. We sang, when we see Christ, it will be worth it all. Faith can see that. Faith sees that. We don't need to have a screen with a picture of it. Faith can see that. Faith sees. And it's real. Faith is cleaving to God. Faith is seeking God, coming to God, pleasing God. And all of this requires faith. Notice Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11. And verse 6. Without faith, it is impossible to please Him. Without faith, you cannot please God. For he that cometh to God. Something else we do. We please God. We do so by faith. We can come to God. But he that cometh to God must believe that He is God, and that He is a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. So we see three things here. We see we can please God, we can come to God, we can seek God, but not without faith. Faith is required of all of those. And worship involves all of those. And worship requires faith. Another component of worship is praise. In true worship, there's praise. Now, praise must have an object. And we've already seen that the object of worship is God. The object of praise is not man. The object of praise is God. I believe that a worship service is set aside for God. I don't believe that a worship service is the time nor the place to praise man. If you want to thank somebody for doing something, there's nothing wrong with that. But don't do it during a worship service. Because a worship service isn't about them, it's about God. It's about God. And praise is an act of expression by the worshiper. It is the expression of admiration. It is the expression of adoration and devotion to God. And in all worship, there is praise. All worship involves praise to God. And we could go on a long time concerning praise, but we're not going to. But notice in Psalm 100, concerning that, Psalm 100, verse 4. Enter into His gates with thanksgiving and into His courts with praise. We're to enter the doors with praise in our hearts. You don't wait till you get here and hope that somebody will stir you to praise. No, we're to enter with praise in our hearts. We're to enter praising God. And then when the service begins, we're to lift up praise to Him. We see in worship there's also thanksgiving. We're to enter with thanksgiving. Worship involves giving thanks to God. A thankful spirit is simply a spirit that is content with God. A soul that is not satisfied with God cannot worship God. You have to be content with God. You have to be content with what God's doing in your life. You have to be content. You have to be satisfied with God. And there are a lot of people who want to blame their whole miserable life on God. They can't worship because you have to be satisfied with God. You have to be satisfied with His will. You have to be satisfied with all that He does. In all true worship, there's got to be surrender to God. A relinquishing of possession and claim to our lives. A letting go of our own ways. A yielding to God's ways. Presenting ourselves to God. That's worship. Worship is presenting to God. It's not about what we receive, it's about giving to God. In surrender, there's an acknowledgement of God's right and God's claim upon our entire being. You want to know why a lot of people cannot surrender to God? Is because they do not feel that God has a right or a claim on that area of their life. And let me tell you something, God has a right and claim to every area, every aspect of our life. And when we recognize that, we have no problem just turning it over to Him. And that's what we do when we worship. You see, when you worship God, you fill up your life. You fill up your life with God. That's what we're to be doing here. We're to be filling up our life with God. We've walked in the world, and now we're to fill up our life with God. And church provides that opportunity. It provides the opportunity to worship. It provides the opportunity of all these things. In worship, there is a commitment to God. You cannot worship God and be rebelling against God at the same time. In worship, we are committing ourselves to the Lord. And then lastly, for tonight anyway, in worship there is conformity to God. We become more like Him. We don't become completely like Him, but we become more godlike. We become more godly in worship. There is to be a conformity to God. We become more like Him. Something happens to us. When nothing happens, we haven't worshiped. And perhaps this is the best measuring stick concerning our worship, is how much are we conforming to God? Am I more conformed to God than when I came in? Am I thinking more godly things than when I came in? Or am I fuming about something that someone has done or not done? If we're true, we can measure our worship by our conformity to God. Again, true worship leaves an impression upon us. And as we've said often, what that means is when the worship service is over, it's not over. It's not over. It keeps on going. It keeps on going. But the goal in all worship is God. That's the goal. And people today are looking for all the wrong things when it comes to church. Well, do they have this? Do they have this? Do they have that? Do they have a nice... And on and on and on it goes. What about, do they provide an opportunity to worship? Do they worship the Lord? What's more important? Worshiping God? Oh, they got to have activities for my children. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with activities, but that does not replace worship. It doesn't replace worship. Nothing does. And it's not to enter into worship. So God help us to worship in spirit and in truth. Next week we'll continue with the subject of worship, and we'll just look at one component, and that is the component of emotion in worship. Brother Ben, if you'd come and lead us in a